Hey there, Philip the Librarian here, and I just read the book Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. Now, I know this book came out a few years ago, and a lot of people have already reviewed it, so chances are I'm not going to say much that hasn't already been said. I just thought I would share my thoughts about it. I liked this book. I enjoyed it. I probably liked the first half better than the second half. And I guess I can kind of see why people made such a big deal about this book. But I definitely didn't love it. I didn't think there was anything really special about it, and I had a few issues with it. So basically, Where the Crawdads Sing is a story about a girl named Kaya who is raised in a marsh with her family, and then her mother leaves because her mother can't stand her father anymore. And then all her siblings leave, and the father, who is a big drinker, leaves eventually, and then Kaya is just left alone in the marsh, and she doesn't know where else to go because she's just lived in the marsh all her life. She doesn't really have much of a choice because the marsh is basically the only place she knows. So she becomes the Marsh Girl, and everyone calls her the Marsh Girl. The marsh is right near a town called Barkley Cove, and she doesn't like to go into Barkley Cove because the people there make fun of her. So she mostly just stays in this little cottage in the marsh, and then this gradually leads to a love triangle. She makes friends with this boy named Tate, who actually has been in the marsh since he was a kid. And then later she gets involved with another guy named Chase. Tate is like this really nice guy. He's kind of a Boy Scout. Chase is this womanizing jerk, and in this way it rather resembles the novel Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And then later Chase is found dead, and people suspect that Kaya had something to do with it. I feel like the author was a little too in love with her own character. I felt like Kaya ended up being like just a little too righteous. She's very isolated from everyone else, which made me think of Lisbeth Salander. And she ends up becoming extremely knowledgeable about nature, which of course reminded me of Tarzan. And I feel like the author was really trying to shove down our throats, oh, she's just this poor woman, all these terrible things have happened to her, and everyone in Barkley Cove is prejudiced against her. And don't get me wrong, I agree there's plenty of prejudice in the world, but I felt like Delia Owens was really shoving this down our throats. It did get old after a while. Another issue I had with the novel was that most of the time the characters didn't really make their own choices. They just kind of acted out of necessity. I mean, Kaya's brothers and sisters just leave the marsh one by one because they have to. They just can't stand to live there anymore. Kaya tries to go to school, but she doesn't go back after one day because she can't stand the school. She can't stand the students laughing at her. And it's hard to blame the students. I mean, they're just kids. They don't know any better. Tate is clearly in love with Kaya, but he knows that Kaya cannot fit into the civilized world, so he decides to leave her. I guess that was kind of a choice, but I do sympathize with him. Kaya gets really angry at Tate because he hurt her. I can't blame her for that. And then Kaya takes up with Chase because she just needs companionship. I mean, no one else seems to want to be around her. And Kaya basically just has to learn how to survive. And, this is not a choice. It's just because this is what every living thing has to do. Every living thing has to survive. Another thing that bothered me was how it was kind of unrealistic that Kaya was able to do so well in the marsh. I mean, by herself, as a little girl who cannot even read at first. I mean, does she never get sick? She never needs to go to a doctor? As far as I can tell, she's never gone to a dentist in her life. She doesn't seem to know anything about hygiene. And yet, a lot of men in the book describe her as attractive. She doesn't learn to read until She's, I think, almost 10 years old when Tate teaches her to read, and yet she becomes a published author at the age of 22. Again, I just feel like the author is a little too in love with her own character. You know, it's a little too convenient how Kaya is just has the magic touch. But honestly, the biggest problem I had with this book was the way Kaya becomes kind of a legend in Barkley Cove. The novel describes Kaya in the marsh, you know, doing stuff in the marsh, learning how to use the plants. There are a lot of beautiful descriptions of the marsh in this book, seen through the eyes of Kaya. And Kaya, of course, learns how to live in the marsh. She learns about the different plants and animals there. By the end of the novel, the town thinks of her as the marsh girl, and they're not really fascinated by the marsh. They're just fascinated by her. And I feel like by doing this, Delia Owens kind of defeats what made the story interesting. I liked the descriptions, especially during the first half, of Kaya in nature, and by the end of the novel, I feel like Owens kind of reduces this to this figure of legend, you know, this special marsh girl who understood the marsh like no one else ever could, and I feel like that's kind of limiting. I feel like this book might have been better if it had not tried to have this elaborate plot with the love triangle and eventually this whole courtroom drama. I feel like if this had been just a series of short stories about a girl living in a marsh, kind of like Mowgli in the Jungle Book, if it had been more like that, then this book might have been even more enjoyable. Because as it is, I felt like Owens couldn't decide whether she wanted the reader to be able to relate to Kaya as a human being, or if Owens wanted the reader to see Kaya as this kind of mysterious figure who eludes everyone. And don't get me wrong, I guess you can do both in a book, but I felt like in this novel she should have chosen one or the other. So, like I said, the young man Chase is found dead. People suspect that Kaya did it, and there's an investigation. She eventually gets arrested. There's a courtroom. There's a trial. I'm not going to give away the ending, but I felt like the ending did not make Kaya any more relatable. I felt like if the ending is an indication, then Owens was leaning more toward making Kaya into this kind of legendary figure, and I just feel like I might have preferred if this book had just been a series of loosely connected narratives about Kaya doing different things in the marsh. Kind of like Mary Poppins, almost. I know that sounds weird, but I can't help but think of the Mary Poppins books. Anyway, that's my review of Where the Crawdads Sing. The title, Where the Crawdads Sing, refers to the part of the swamp far in the bush where critters are wild, still behaving like critters. Of course, this reminds me of Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. So that's my quick review of Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. Do you agree with my assessment? Do you disagree? Leave a comment below and feel free to subscribe. This is Philip the Librarian signing off.